So welcome to our Sunday morning class again. So glad to have you here. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Jefferson. And he recently was a professor of homiletics at a theological school in India and has recently made a career change and a move. So he is a special guest for many reasons, one of which is in this moment in his life, he is changing jobs, expecting a new baby in a month, and moved out of state. He's still like, he's been a professor of homiletics. He's started a consulting practice or helping a consulting practice on coaching preachers and teaching homiletics. That business is up and running. And he's also does guest preaching, which he will do in about an hour and a half. On your market, say go.
Thank you. It's good to be with you today. My name is Mark Jefferson. I'm a native of Hampton, Virginia, not too far from here, so we're very familiar. I've come because I've been invited to preach and to share with you. And what I want to share with you briefly is my previous preaching journey over the last 7 years, and what I think that means and what that portends for the future of preaching in the church as a whole. So for the last 7 years, I was an assistant professor of homiletics and a visiting professor of homiletics at a school called Virginia Theological Seminary. Anybody heard of it? There you go. Yeah, it's inside baseball. I got you. But I got you. When they asked me to work there, I didn't know anything about them either. And I was from Virginia, so that's how it goes. Well, what I came to find is that Virginia Theological Seminary is the largest Episcopal Anglican seminary in the world. Any Episcopalians, previous Episcopalians, quasi, there you go. Got a couple of you again inside baseball. So they asked me to teach preaching there in 2016. I had a couple of questions like, where is this place and what are Episcopalians? Once they could solve those for me, I found myself in this interesting space. Prior to arriving at Virginia Theological, I taught in Pittsburgh for a year at Pittsburgh Theological with the Presbyterians. Or then they got a couple of Presbyterians in the house. I graduated from Emory University with my MD and my Ph.D. So I spent a lot of time in Atlanta, but I became a Baptist at a Methodist school. But I came to a Methodist seminary as a Pentecostal.
Still looking for your way in life.
I think my way is the way. So my journey into preaching in the Christian life has been one that has been ecumenical in scope, but also intensely African-American in context, because I'm a child of Virginia. And I'm a child of Southeastern Virginia, which, as many of you know, is different than Northern Virginia. So my experience in preaching has been one of being able to hear broadly what's going on, and then find where the gospel message is being iterated, and then share that, right? So I'm at this place where I found myself preaching in spaces that I've never been in before. I was a fairly seasoned preacher before I showed up there. I preached 16 years before I showed up to the seminary. But I'd never preached to so many white people before, ever. And so that was a culture shock. And then it was like the culture shock plus the class piece. It was just a really interesting matrix of sorting out what it means to be a Christian, right? The dean and president of my institution at the time came to me and said, our seminary turns 200 years old in a few years. I'm like, yeah, okay. And he said, would you be willing to preach 200 sermons around the world to celebrate our bicentennial and to commemorate, our efforts into further preaching in the world? Probably said yes a little sooner than I probably should have. But I didn't quite do the short math. Like 200 sermons is 5 years of preaching almost every weekend. And I was off, right? There was no blueprint, no map. We were just going to figure this out. And what I found is that as I began to go to Episcopal churches and Baptist churches and Pentecostal churches and preach in jails and prisons, preaching big cathedrals, and to preach in little storefronts, to do funerals and weddings, to really take on the fullness of the preaching mantle across all the different spectrums, I found a couple of things that were concerning. Number one, a lot of clergy are struggling because their preaching is losing imagination. The drain of the job, day in and day out, just like any job, whether you're a physician, you can get tired of being a physician. The things of life that are so vital can become routinized, right? So the same thing with spiritual wise. So one who's supposed to go to the text and to share and what that means for the congregation in the world and to be able to offer one's life, that was depleting their spiritual resources and their imaginative resources. So their preaching was sinking. There was a disconnect between the congregation and the pew. In the pulpit assumed the pew wanted to hear certain things. Pew was like, why isn't the pulpit addressing certain things? And so this disinterest, the chasm formed in between the pulpit and the pew. I also found that there were a lot of lay people who had callings to do more, but they didn't feel confident either in their call or in their knowledge of the faith to be able to actualize that into speech. So they feel faith in their heart, but they can't quite turn it into, I'm not even going to say a sermon. I don't want to scare you with that, but they couldn't turn it into a coherent faith story that allowed other people into. Yeah. So I'm encountering kind of these revolving conversations that I go from place to place. I do forums like this all the time, and people can say, they look around the corner and say, okay, but then the rector will come to me and say, what can you do to help my people hear me? And I said, that sounds like a consulting business. And so that's kind of how I turned it what I do now. I'll talk about that later. This was one of the pivotal moments, and this will kind of shape the conversation for today. So at this time, I've preached maybe 100, or probably 2.5 years in, starting to come out of the pandemic. So I'm 100 sermons or 100 some odd sermons into the 200. Number one, I didn't think I was going to finish, and neither did anybody else. I mean, just thinking about the coordination of travel, time, writing sermons, delivering them, driving yourself there, churches don't have no money, you think about all the realities of that, and it really did seem like a very ominous task. But it was going exceedingly well, even during the pandemic. People would invite me out to preach in empty churches, and they recorded it. I mean, it was a fascinating experience. I had a student, and she invited me to South Africa to preach. I said, well, friend, I can't really squeeze in South Africa in the midst of all I got going on. I want to, but I really don't have the time. And she said, I think you should make the time. And I said, friend, I really don't think I can do it. And she said, well, how about this? I'm going to entreat the ancestors. I'm going to beseech heaven so that you can make time to make this happen. I said, okay. Lo and behold, I was able to squeeze out some time, move some things around. So I was going to go Christmas time 2 years ago. Well, Christmas time 2 years ago, November, October, early December, people were worried about some sort of strain outbreak, something like that. All that stuff. But anyway, the world was in the tizzy. Getting to South Africa was a real challenge. Had to amend my trip, ended up going for 1 week instead of 3. So I went to Cape Town to preach at St. George's Cathedral. St. George's Cathedral is the Anglican cathedral in Cape Town, where the Archbishop Desmond Tutu resided for many, many years. The woman that invited me to preach in Cape Town is one of Desmond Tutu's daughters, who was one of my students. So her family was my host during Christmas 2 years ago while I was there, which was an exciting experience. You never know how God's going to use you, and you never know which way the world is going to turn. So while I'm there, I was unable to see the Archbishop because he was in fragile care. I didn't understand that fragile care is like hospice. So I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, he's gonna die like while I'm here. So this world luminary is about to die, and if he dies before Sunday, I'm gonna have to preach on the heels of this man dying with his family. I'm with his family, like we're eating Christmas dinner together. I go home. I'm the sickest I've ever been in my life. after this. I mean, I am sick. Like, if you ever been sick in a hotel, that is the worst kind of sick. Because there's no home convenience. It's like you have to go find everything. So I was sick in the hotel, laid out on the floor, I had a bath, toilet towel on. I'm incoherent. I'm throwing up in the toilet. I like gashes over my eye, like to this day, because I mean, my head was in there. Those water saver toilets, when the water's real low, so you gotta really put your head in there. I'm sick. I finally get myself to the bed. I get a phone call like around 6 in the morning. It's Naomi, my host. Naomi says, well, number one, you left your owl at our house. Number two, I can't bring it to you because my dad just died. I said, well, I don't want to pile on, but I am like ill beyond belief right now, like ill. She said, I hope we didn't make you sick. I said, no, this is a food sickness, you know. This was different. This wasn't like your regular incapacitation here. This was like special. So I ended up WhatsApping the dean, telling him that I couldn't make it. So I'm in the bed. It's like 9 o'clock. I said, well, you know what? If I'm gonna die, let me at least die on the way to the hospital. Like I'm so far away. Like I'm right on the beach. So like if I'm gonna die, at least let me be in transit. So I WhatsApped the dean. I said, you know what? I'll be there. Just give me like 15 minutes. I'm gonna be there. You know, whatever happens, it's gonna make moves anyhow. So I get myself together. I go, and if you go on my Facebook page, I think I started the video. I was like unbearably sick. So do y'all do like instances? Bells and bells?
Not very often.
Okay. Well, the church just found out that he died, like right when I got there. There's this collective. And then there's this poor guest preacher who's like struggling to get to the pulpit, who has to be more preached. I end up preaching. It goes decently well. But this is what grabbed me, and this is kind of what I want to lift up. What grabbed me is the fact that his daughter called me afterwards. She said, I heard it went well. Are you feeling better? I said, I actually feel a lot better. I said, let me tell you what I think this was. I said, your father was passing as I'm laid out on the ground, sweating and convulsing. I said, I don't take it lightly that I just spent the holiday with his family. I've been in his house. I've touched his things. I've read his books. I've done everything but meet the man. Now I have an opportunity to do this. I said, I don't know what to call it, but what we'll do, we'll call it even. You entreated the ancestors, you prayed to God, I'm here. And since that experience, my life has changed. And what I mean is that it's changed because I've been able to find clarity about what it is that I'm supposed to do in my life. And what I'm supposed to do in my life, in many ways, is to help cultivate the imagination of Christians and people in general. Ministers in particular, because their job and their imagination helps you all to see the world afresh yourself. Where I'm concerned is that this need and desire for freshness and this possibility for renewal is being entreated upon and being encircled in many ways by technological conveniences. I'm concerned that artificial intelligence and the ways in which we're not cultivated into practical debate to be able to hold multiple opinions, the ways in which we've been eroded as a society is causing all of our imaginations into this crisis point, but particularly what it means to be a Christian. Because too many preachers are so worn down imaginatively that it's hard for them to imagine the world that the text is presenting, because they're so wedged into the world that is today. I'm concerned because if you look at Pew polls and other polling instruments and organizations, they'll tell you people come to church for the community, they come for the music, they come for different strands of worship, they come as a way of giving back to the community and all of that, but primarily they come for preaching. Yet, theological education is diminishing preaching. There's less and less preaching courses being taught. There's less and less places for preachers to do formation after they graduate. You can graduate seminary and only preach 3 sermons. Should be astounding. Any doctors in here? Any lawyers? Imagine your doctor saying, hey, just got my degree. This is my 4th surgery, so don't worry. I thought y'all did a few of these. No, it's just, we learned a lot, but we didn't really chance to do. And so I'm seeing these mounting areas of concern, creating this kind of like crescendo of concern that I'm kind of going around advocating that we attend to, which is how are we as Christians imagining our faith, not just currently, but how shall we imagine it for the future? And my hope is that more of you all will take on the mantle of proclaiming faith for yourself, so that number one, it makes it easier for your minister and the ministers who serve you to help you, because you were therefore doing the thing that takes the pressure off of them. So I'm not just asking for people to be better Christians just because. I'm saying if you care about your institution, if you care about your church, if you care about the seminaries that produce ministers, if you care about the work of God in the world, we all have to take on an active part in proclamation and not allowing our imagination to be deformed by the strangeness of our culture. So my preaching journey, these 200 sermons that I started out doing, ended up being 260 sermons in 5 years. I preached multiple times a week, different sermons on Sundays. It was nonstop. I was tired. But I'm glad that I did it. I'm glad I did it because, number one, I have profound hope for the Christian church. Number two, I'm not as hopeful for the churches that make up the church. The gospel will go on. Will all these churches go on with the gospel? I don't know. And I think that's a relevant point for us to raise, because the absolute certainty of our endeavors working out isn't there. Churches are institutions that are made by people. So these institutions decide not to go on with the gospel will still go on. But part of these institutions and fine churches like yourselves coming together is to say that we're going to take up our place as Christians. And I'm going to raise my individual voice, however God influences me to do that. Because if we don't, the world will impose its imagination upon us, instead of us imposing our imagination upon the world. So in all the preaching that I've done, I wrote like 255 new sermons. That's a lot of writing without the teaching. And I have a life and books coming out and all that other stuff. So in many ways, I use that wedge period, that 7-year period, to preach and to learn and to absorb and to try to get a practical sense of what's happening in the life of churches, so that I can go and be a blessing to them in a more concrete way. So one of the ways that I'm trying to remedy this crisis of imagination that I'm seeing in ministers is to, number one, liberate them from their preaching only being in the pulpit. We preach every day, and from time to time we say something. The integrity of our lives gives us a platform to speak, not standing in the pulpit in front of people. And so re-energizing focus around that concept, I think, is going to help make Christian preaching more effective, not just because people like me do it, but Christian preaching will be more energized because people like you do it. And I think some of my colleagues are concerned that some of y'all might be better than some of us. And is that a bad thing? It's not for the furtherance of the gospel, might be for the furtherance of some other things. But I think we're at this inflection point, not just in faith, but in society as a whole, where there are life and death, almost eternal type questions on the human sphere. Anyway, on the human plane, we're dealing with questions about what it means to be a human being. Singularity, being wedged into, woven into machines, so it's one tapestry of thought. Like, we are talking about the fate of the world. And I think too many of us have taken our responsibility and offloaded it onto the minister, instead of saying, wait, I there's something about my own Christian life that means I have to wade out into faith more and to live more vociferously about what it means I believe. So I just want to hear what you all think. I know you probably didn't expect to hear this morning. But what were some of your thoughts? And we can just engage that. There's some more I can cover, but I want to know what you think. Did anything strike you? Any questions, comments?
How is that, or so you worked with preachers, have you worked with congregations as well, giving them, so how have they responded to the advice and like being willing to vocalize what they're wanting to hear and what they're wanting to do?
You know what's been interesting? People want more than what they're getting, but often don't know how to constructively offer that. So they'll tell the minister what they're not getting from her or him, instead of saying, this is what we're looking for in our own faith life. So it's the vocabulary, where most places want the same thing, they just couldn't figure out how to bridge that gap, because people typically want more. I was a child who grew up in Sunday school. So in my mind, it was Sunday school church. It wasn't get there in time for church. So the lack of formation that's occurred over time in churches has put this conversation in a very tedious place, because if people are better formed, people are better informed. If they're better informed, they can be better members and better Christians and all of that. I was preaching at a church, and this has happened a few times more than I'm happy to admit, but this happens. Woman comes up to me in the handshake line. Don't let this be you today. And she says to me, Dr. Jefferson, your sermon was so good, I almost said amen. She said, I had to fight it. I sat on my hands. And I'm thinking, it's about such a lady. That sounds painful. But it dawned on me what she was trying to say. She had an authentic experience, but for whatever reason, how she construes the church and the congregation and all that stuff, she didn't feel liberated to be who she felt like she needed to be at that moment. How did you come to church to be bound? She came so she could bind herself and then brag like she did something. I'm like, lady, I wanted to say this, but I don't know her. I mean, that's I just thought, like, you don't hold in sneezes, burps, farts, any of this other stuff, it's not good for you. And you gonna hold back an amen, as rare as those might come for you. But I realized as I heard that in more and more places, people would say, yeah, I almost wanted to raise my hand. I just kept thinking, people want to be more. But for whatever reason, how they think about church, how they think about this church, or how they think about class, how people in my town will look, whatever was going on in their mind that organized their thoughts, they could not just do the basic. Some of these same folks, if you catch them at 4 o'clock at the Commanders game, face painted, they're hoarse. They sat in traffic an hour and a half to get in, hour and a half to get out. Whether the team won or lost didn't matter. But in church, they fought every good inclination to be connected to the Spirit. And I think for me, seeing that made me say, we got to figure out how to bridge that. We all seen places. So they've been really receptive. I think more receptive than I probably anticipated. You would have told me 7 years ago. I don't know how. The sheep led to the slaughter or something. But no, it worked out.
So Mark, I got a quick question for you. I'm sorry, Ken, do you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I imagine you come into situations where the pastor is established, the congregation is established, and there's this divide of disinterest. I like that phrase. We're about to have a situation. I was on search committee for Carol. She's retiring. We're going to find a new pastor. What's the best way to introduce a pastor to a congregation and a congregation to a pastor, besides trying to make sure we get above a 90% vote?
I think it's important for churches to be honest about where they are. It's that A lot of churches promote themselves by who they want to be. We're a community that we. Okay. If I'm a minister, I'm gonna ask myself, okay, above all the fluff, where's the cake?
Yeah.
Right? And I think being honest about that attracts people to the work because people don't mind hard work that's meaningful. What people don't like is to be told one thing to something else. So if I already know we're in for a haul, that's better than me realizing that I should have been in for a haul. It changes my disposition, it changes my attitude, it changes, I think honesty going in brings the right people to at least have that critical conversation. If you come in like this, you can't have that critical conversation. You're talking, glad to have a job, glad to hire you. I need some money. We need somebody to do this job. That can't be enough for a pastor. Right? If you wanted somebody to do some other things, maybe, but if there's a culture that's trying to be created here, then that can't be the only thing that binds, holds, and sticks. But I just think honesty and courageous honesty allows the right people to take up the mantle and then those critical. I think sometimes hiring people brings out the best and worst in churches because churches have this inherent need as an institution does to tell its own story in its best way. But sometimes the person that's going to help you get to that is the one who's going to come in where it's at and not someone who thinks it's this already.
But what if it's already a perfect congregation?
Early. But I'm willing to bet one of you is perfect. I think we should go off the
Thank you. I'm curious what your thoughts are on lay preaching. You know, a number of denominations now are developing programs with that thought in mind, decentralizing the seminary process and getting education out to people in their communities. Do you see that as part of the answer for what we're talking about?
I believe in that. I found that my most meaningful teaching was to lay groups and the deacons. When people come to seminary, there's a certain expectation. Go to seminary to get a theological degree, to be credentialed. But to be able to take seminary information, information has been locked away in the ivory tower, and to disseminate that and have people who have different jobs, professions, careers, interests, talents, perspectives, engage that, that's the future of the church. I think seminaries and theological institutions have harnessed particularly the resourcing of effective preaching into the curriculum that's at the seminary level. But that's not sustainable anymore. Seminary numbers are going down, which is why there's a redistribution of programming about how we go about it. Most churches in the next 10 years won't be able to afford full-time ministers in many respects. So bivocational ministers are going to go up. Deacons and people preaching more often goes up. I've preached in a lot of churches where I was giving respite for lay preachers who were preaching every week because they couldn't afford a full-time minister. So when they saw me, they're like, oh my God, somebody from a seminary. First off, anybody coming, period. I mean, I preached in places like Shadron, Nebraska. You know where Shadron, Nebraska is? We got one. Nebraska has a panhandle. Do you know Nebraska has a panhandle? We got two, right? I drove from Alexandria, Virginia to Shadron, Nebraska, because I wanted to see the country that I was flying over. And I got a chance, I drove all over this country. I've driven 48 states, flew to one, I think it's in 6 countries doing this. So I saw the country in a swath of time and in the breadth of experience that very few people get a chance to do. And the future is in the people. And if I may give a political corollary to that, I also want to say too much of our power has been given over to corporations, which has infantilized us as citizens. And now we find ourselves in the same kind of theological conundrum that we are in politically, where we've outsourced our power to be who we need to be, the people who make choices for us. And we see that the system's out of kilter. So I don't see it as happenstance that these things are functioning on the same plane. my advocacy as a whole is for people to empower themselves so that we can therefore bring balance to these institutions that are supposed to serve us more effectively. I saw a hand somewhere, or maybe that's an eyebrow. Yes, sir.
I'm a retired preacher,
Bless you.
and and amazing, I've preached twice in black churches.
Mhm.
It was utterly amazing. I felt lifted up by the congregation. The congregation was for me. They were helping me just with with affirming a good sentence I had, or in one case, they made negative sounds over the sentence I had. I moved quickly on. And it was just such a different experience for what I'm accustomed to in preaching in white churches.
Mhm.
What we have at Duke Chapel, I'm thinking, so I won't say things I'll later regret, but we have a dean of the chapel who is black Pentecostal. You're thinking, what is a black Pentecostal doing in a place like this? And I feel, I've never talked to him about it. He said a few things. I feel like he would like for us, the congregation, to be more expressive.
Watch this. Call and response, how it's typically understood, particularly when people envision it in the African American, typically becoming Black Baptist, Pentecostal kind of traditions. Call and response is active engagement with the preacher. But, and I think that's true. I've also been in black churches and preached where, you know, you could hear a rat shuffling for cheese, you know, like it's really quiet in there too. What I found is that this is my own experience, expression in class typically are some sort of relatable kind of corollary. How people relate themselves typically expressed by their class designation more so than especially as I'm kind of moving about now in the world. I'll also say that call and response happens in all churches. It's just that sometimes what's being called and what's being responded to isn't clicking, right? So I can't say that he may want that or not want that, but what I will say from my relationship with Dr. Dean Power is that he wants you all to live more embodied in the spirit, whatever that means to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a higher mark than being responsive. Because I think if you read his books, if you listen to his lectures, what he's inviting people into is to live out a spirituality that moves your body, and moves your lungs, and moves you to then do. So less about saying amen in church, or you move to live differently in the world, and then that might move you to therefore say or do in the worship space. And I think if that's what his hope is, that's also my hope too, which is if people live more fully into who they are, it would scare them how good they could be. And I think it's more of an artificial lid on each one of us that keeps us more so than anything else. I think some of us know we can be more and we just say, I'm okay. And I think that's the spirit pushing against you saying, says who? And that's why you come back to do chapel every week, because something about the spirit says, yes, and. Not yes, you're a good Christian, yes, and. And I think that's the call of the spirit. So, and I also think they were cheering you on because they didn't want you to fail. They want you to succeed. And I think most congregations that I preach in wanted me to succeed. People have driven 45 minutes and put 3 kids in the minivan. They got their husband who didn't want to come. He owed his wife a favor, so he's coming. You know, so wife is like, she's frazzled, trying to get everybody to go, and the grandparents going to meet there, but the grandparents, you know, people go through all of that to hear a bad sermon. I'm upset for people. Because the times where I'm not preaching and I go to church, number one, if I'm not preaching and I go to church, friend, I either like you or the Spirit is moving me. Because I'm tired of churches a lot of times. So when I go and then somebody gives me some warmed over, hard crusted bread sermon, I'm offended. I'm upset. Because if you took this as seriously as I took it, I can imagine a miss is different than not trying. We all miss. You cook enough for your family, you're gonna miss. You know, enough of anything you're gonna miss, but not trying is totally different than missing. And I just think what we're asking, what I'm asking ministers to do, and what I'm asking congregations to do, is to raise the stakes. Raise the stakes. Because otherwise, we're just getting together and slowly drifting into oblivion. Unless we raise the stakes and really put our faith as the focal point of our, not just our intellectual life or our inner life, but we make it the focal point of making concrete in our current reality, it's not gonna mean anything. Which is why we need each of you to do it, not just a handful of nations to get sent away to some wonderful place to learn. What you thinking, new person? I see you churning over there. What you thinking?
Well, I just graduated from seminary,
Which
so
one?
this one.
Hey!
Yeah, so yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what you're saying. I think I was lucky that I had a great mentor and I felt my calling much younger, so I preached a good bit before I came to seminary. But it is true, I mean, in seminary, in my main preaching class, and I took another one, but that was only 2 classes, so specialty preaching class. So the first one that I took was only 3 sermons. And so if no one had ever had experience before or after, then that was it. You know, that was the 3 sermons you did. So it is true what you said. And yeah, I think good sermons are important to me. I love preaching. I feel very comfortable in the pulpit. So for me, I think it's important. I also do think I see congregations that are worn out and tired, and a lot of pastors who don't want to, but you know, kind of repeat the same things. And I think, yeah, I think sermons are supposed to be inspirational for people, both the pastor and the congregation. And so I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And I think for me, I think the pastors should be bringing out who the congregation is every week and then pushing them forward. And so I hope a congregation would do the same for a preacher.
Anybody else? What you thinking?
Well, this is kind of going with Ken's question. What types of things are being done to train lay people to be able, when they get in the pulpit, not to say things that would be against the scripture? I mean, we got a lot of bright people, but a lot of people who are great speakers, might be a great teacher, but you do want it to be theologically sound. So what types of things are being done to help that? So when they get up there, they do well.
So to be honest, so this is kind of how I ventured into what I was doing. So about a year ago, I got married in August of last year. So leading up to my marriage, I was just finishing my 200th sermon. Sermon 200 was at St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. That was a wonderful, strange experience there. Wonderful because I had a chance to see the Holy Land and all that kind of stuff. Strange because I flew in Washington, D.C. So it was President Biden clogging up traffic in D.C. and then clogging up traffic in Jerusalem too. So I couldn't escape him, you know what I'm saying? Because this hotel was around the corner from mine, and so they had buses parked head to head with people with machine guns. It was tense. It was tense. Oh God. That experience was rich, but I began to think about, okay, what about after this? Now what? And now I more and more of my time is being asked for to do exactly what you're saying. Can I teach a group of deacons how to preach via Zoom? Can I do some sort of hybrid thing? And then I started to see that my time started doing more of that because there wasn't a lot of people in spaces that could do it or do it at a high level. You might have some retired clergy who do it, but it's different to have somebody who is Ph.D. in homiletics, studied with the best homileticians, preached all over the world. So it's a different kind of experience. And I think that incentivized me to figure out how else outside the seminary system I could be of help. Because there wasn't a lot. The Episcopal Preaching Foundation does some of that stuff. There's some other kind of parachurch situations, but not in any kind of like coordinated, systemic, or even easily accessible form. So I think that's what I'm trying to carve out now, is having these conversations, seeing where are people interested, and then figuring out how can we inform people toward that goal. So that's what led me toward kind of pursuing consulting full time. Like, how do we do this? And so helping clergy is one piece, but that's not going to right the balance. If anything, it just further does this. I'm telling this person how to be better, now you're like, I got all these ideas, but I gotta do them instead of how do I cultivate people so we can do it. So to answer your question, not as many as you would think, which is kind of why it was during. I'll send my personal information to Angela, and she'll send it out to you all if you all are interested. But I just think it's important. It's important for Christians to live out their faith, because everybody else is living out their faith, even if their faith is not some sort of organized religion. People live out what they believe, no matter what it is. They may call it something else, but the quantity and quality of their life is their faith profession. I just want Christians to level up. Anybody else?
Go ahead.
They're also polite.
I'm curious what would happen to follow up to your question. If this church body, if the congregation, if leadership just if there was to be some sort of a change in some sort of a little bit different experience where there was some involvement, it's just all one way. Love is beautiful, it's reflective, it's irreverent, it's everything else. But I don't know, is there an appetite? Is what would happen? I mean, I don't know. I've only been here for, say, 2 years and during the pandemic. So has it happened?
Yeah.
Would it? You'll be speaking today, but could it have? I mean, because I'm not really an emotional person, but it wouldn't be me, but I recognize it. I've been in places where I've appreciated it. You're saying you're there. So I'm like, well, I don't know. And as we're in a, I don't say unfortunately, but as we're in this opportunity, a pastoral opportunity, this might be a question that the future minister may have. And what is our, so I don't know. So this is almost a pre-discussion as a consultant. To my fellow members, I don't know. It's just my thought. I don't know what to do with it.
I will, if I just add an anecdote, one of our members, in talking about expressiveness, she said, well, I usually pray like this, right, with my hands folded. And then I decided to do something different and pray like that. And she said, it made a real difference for me. And then I joked and said, we at Duke Chapel, when we get expressive, we go like this.
Yes, sir.
The one time that, since we've been here, that I really felt like we were moving in that direction, a more expressive direction, was when we had Duke Black Alumni Weekend. And we were sitting in the midst of a lot of Duke Black alumni. And I was getting lifted by the Spirit. And I could also see a lot of Duke Black alumni feeling restrained. That's a good experience. And it doesn't, that's in the Bible. this is the way you pray in the Psalms.
Yeah. Let's look at it like this. Maybe the call for this chapel isn't to be more of what other people are. Maybe the call is to actualize who each of you all are. My argument is that you all have not seen you all operating at you all's highest, no matter how great the past has been. So maybe what could be used as a juxtaposition is, where in my heart do I know I need to continue to grow? Where is there asymmetry? And how can I make that more symmetrical? And I think as this church in particular begins to find that level, each of you will find yourselves living in different ways, so that when we all come together, you may not know what happens from Sunday to Sunday. And I think that is scary too. But the move of the Spirit should make us nervous, even scare us, but it shouldn't keep us from meeting the Spirit where the Spirit is engaging us.
Amen.
And I think
That movement, and I get it, not much movement, yeah.
that's the level that instead of making it racial or class, let's just say, for this body of people here, what does it mean for us to fully invest in ourselves so that when we die empty? I want to be tapped out. I want to give this all I got. I don't get a chance to bring in the rest for a rebate or anything. This is it. So for me, I committed my life to preaching and teaching people because this was the one way I know that I could help to improve the world, something that I know improves and changes the world. If God bet on you all, because God invested in humanity, God's self, that's the whole purpose of the incarnation. So God thought so much of the human endeavor that it could be powerful. Why are we therefore afraid of the power that God has invested in us to do better? And I think preaching is our opportunity to tap into that. And not just necessarily preaching on Sundays in the pulpit. Some of y'all preach on Facebook, I see. There's these other pulpits of influence that we have in our lives that I think if we became more active, we'll feel less put upon by the world and feel more energized to engage the world. And that's my hope.
I want to send you a hope. Carol mentioned lots of changes going on. Best wishes for you,
Thank you.
especially for your child, being a new father, I take it.
Yeah.
There is,
Yeah, my wife's 8 months pregnant. That's why she's not here. She said, "You want me to come?" I said, no.
there
Let's sit
is
this one out.
There is a whole new world. I have a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. I get to the church. And there is a whole new world and dimension of thinking about church when you have kids and how they relate to church and how they relate to God. And good luck, and I wish you well.
And I also think that influence, perspective, and imagination, if churches harness that,
Yes.
gives them a way forward.
Mhm.
I often notice that churches who are struggling to find a way forward often don't have enough young people to show them which way to go. So I think it's like you said, to that point, I'm looking forward to being innovative. I'm 41, so I'm having my first child at 41. So I'm gonna be cool forever. I'm gonna know all the things that I don't know. I'm gonna be cool forever, right? So I just look at the church in the same way, that the more young people, the more different people that it brings into its ranks, its scope changes, and hopefully it changes its price. It's just like hopefully fatherhood will do me.
I think I keep hearing leading self. You know, I think about, my husband and I were talking about this in the car. You know, I have a new job, it's very challenging. The supervisor doesn't, the leader of the agency doesn't know everything, right? So she's like, y'all come to the table, we gotta solve this together, right? And so there was a circumstance I was in where all of a sudden I was on stage, right? And I was like, I can't say what I planned to say, but what God gave me to say spoke volumes to the people in the audience that I was totally unplanned to do. I guess what I'm hearing from you is that same spirit is what we need in the church, right? So we're so used to, well, looking to the pastor to do things, looking to the Sunday school teacher to do things, looking to deacons. But what are you doing? Like, this is our organization. It's not, and I see so many parallels in that leading self. You know, what is it that you're gonna do if needed to stand on stage? What is it that you're doing when you say you're a Christian and people are looking at you, you're an example? Don't just say, well, let me go talk to the pastor, right? No, the pastor can't be everywhere. If someone's in the hospital, are you there? Like, is that your calling? You know, I remember when I went to college and I told my mom something was happening and I said, I need you to pray for me. She said, you need to pray for yourself. Like this, you know, I was like angry at her about it. Like, why are you not praying for me? And she's like, first of all, I've been praying for you before you were even born. So you don't ever have to ask. So let's get that straight. Second of all, you go to God for yourself. This is your time to go to God, right? And so it dawned on me that it's not my mother's God, it's my God. And if it's my God, then what am I doing for my God's organization, which is this church, which is his followers, which is his congregation. It's not up to Carol, it's not up to Dean Powery, it's not up to speak to everyone that comes in the door, it's up to me, right? And so that, I guess the parallels were just so relevant for me this week.
Faith should organize our whole life. We've done such a good job of compartmentalizing faith to a part of our life. Okay, I'm gonna give God this time. Or, okay, God, I'm sorry to give you this time. So we divided time in all these strange ways that keep us from being able to live fully into what it means for our faith to inform our whole life. And I think the whole Western philosophical construct that has these strange divisions between body and soul and emotion and common sense, I think faith reorganizes all of that because God called and redeemed all of us. So all of us goes to a job. All of us are the ones who are the family members. All of us, not this part, not this part. So like I said about what I said politically and economically, it's the same thing. Friends, our faith integrates us to change everything. Even the things we don't want to change. And that's my time. I'll see you shortly, friends. Thank you for having me.